The Mongol invasion of Europe did not begin with fire. It began with information. In the winter of 1237, Subutai, the most accomplished military strategist in Mongol history, crossed the Volga River with approximately 150,000 mounted warriors. He was 65 years old. He had been conducting campaigns for 4 decades. He did not ride at the front of columns anymore. He traveled in a cart, surrounded by scribes, cartographers, and interpreters. What he was about to do to Europe was not improvisation. It was the execution of a system he had refined across 3 continents. The European nobility did not understand what was approaching. They had heard rumors of Eastern horsemen. They had dismissed them as exaggerated tales from panicked merchants. They had no framework for comprehending an army that moved faster than information, that operated across 1,000 miles with synchronized precision, that treated warfare not as seasonal campaigning, but as permanent administrative function. When Subutai's forces entered Eastern Europe, they did not encounter resistance. They encountered confusion, and in that confusion, they began collecting a very specific category of captive, the daughters of ruling families. The first acquisitions. The initial contact came in Ryazan, December 1237. The Mongol advance forces did not lay siege to the city. They sent envoys. The message was standard across all Mongol conquests: submit, pay tribute, provide hostages, or be destroyed. Ryazan's princes refused. The city fell in 5 days. What happened next established a pattern that would repeat across dozens of European principalities. Mongol soldiers did not indiscriminately slaughter the population. They sorted it. Fighting-age men were separated. Craftsmen were identified and marked. Clergy were catalogued. And women of noble birth were collected. Not all noble women. Specifically, unmarried daughters of ruling families, widows of princes, and wives of military commanders. They were not taken as random spoils of war. They were processed through an identification system. Mongol interpreters, many of them captured Europeans from previous campaigns, moved through groups of captives asking specific questions. What is your family name? Who is your father? What territories does he control? Do you have brothers? Where are they? The women who answered these questions with names that corresponded to political authority were separated from general captives. They were not harmed, they were inventoried. Princess Maria of Ryazan was 19 years old when the city fell. She was the daughter of Prince Yuri, who died in the city's defense. She had 2 younger sisters, ages 16 and 14. All 3 were identified within hours of the city's fall. They were moved to a separate encampment outside the ruined walls. They were provided tents, food, and guards. They were not permitted to leave. Within 2 days, a Mongol official arrived with an interpreter. He did not interrogate them. He recorded information, their names, their father's name, their brothers' names and locations, their families' alliances, their understanding of regional politics, their language capabilities. The conversation lasted approximately 3 hours. It was not violent. It was bureaucratic. When it concluded, the official departed. The sisters remained under guard. They were fed regularly. They were not assaulted. They were not ransomed. They were transported east with the Mongol army as it continued its advance. This was not captivity as Europeans understood it. It was acquisition. The system behind the selection Subutai had spent 40 years perfecting Mongol military intelligence operations. He understood that warfare was not won through battlefield courage. It was won through information asymmetry. An army that knew more than its enemy could dictate terms before fighting began. An army that controlled information about its enemy could manipulate that enemy's decisions. Noble daughters represented concentrated information assets. They knew family structures, succession lines, territorial disputes, alliance networks, marriage negotiations, and resource distributions. They had been raised in environments where political information was discussed openly because women of their class were expected to manage estates, conduct correspondence, and participate in dynastic planning. European nobles did not consider their daughters security risks. They were not military commanders. They were not advisors. They were marriage assets, waiting to be deployed in alliance formations. But to Mongol intelligence operations, they were perfect sources. They had access to information without being perceived as threats. They could be questioned without triggering the resistance that interrogating captured knights would produce. Subutai's intelligence apparatus had refined a specific methodology for extracting information from noble captives. It was not based on torture. Torture produced unreliable information because subjects would say anything to stop pain. Instead, the Mongol approach was based on environment manipulation and incentive alignment. Captured princesses were housed separately from common prisoners. They were provided appropriate accommodations relative to their status. They were addressed by title. They were permitted to retain personal items. They were given servants, usually other captives who spoke their language. They were fed the same rations as Mongol officers. They were not threatened with execution. They were not sexually assaulted by guards. This treatment was not mercy, it was technique. A captive who believed she might survive was more likely to provide accurate information than a captive who believed she was doomed. A captive who was treated according to her perceived social status was more likely to maintain normal conversational patterns, which meant she was more likely to reveal information naturally rather than through resistant responses to direct interrogation. The questioning process was structured across multiple sessions, conducted by different interrogators, using interpreters who had been trained to identify inconsistencies across accounts. The first session established basic information: family structure, territorial holdings, recent political developments. The second session, conducted days later by a different questioner, asked about the same topics from different angles. Inconsistencies were noted, but not challenged immediately. Third and fourth sessions introduced new topics: trade routes, grain storage locations, noble families in conflict, marriage negotiations under discussion, military commanders' reputations. Across multiple conversations, a detailed intelligence picture emerged. And because the conversations were structured as interviews rather than interrogations, many captives did not realize how much information they were providing. The case of Princess Agnes of Poland. In March 1241, Mongol forces defeated a combined Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica. Among the casualties was Duke Henry II of Silesia. His death left a succession crisis. He had multiple sons, but their legitimacy was disputed. His widow, Anna, held significant political authority. His sister, Agnes, had been negotiating a marriage alliance with Bohemian nobles. Agnes was captured 3 days after the battle. She was not at the battlefield. She was at a monastery 15 miles away, where she had taken shelter with other noble women when news of the Mongol advance reached the region. Mongol scouts located the monastery using information provided by local guides who had been offered survival in exchange for cooperation. The monastery was not sacked. Mongol soldiers entered, identified the noble women through questioning, and removed them. The nuns were left unharmed. The monastery's food stores were inventoried, but not confiscated. This precision was characteristic of Subutai's operational approach. Take what has value, ignore what does not. Minimize resistance by demonstrating that cooperation results in survival. Agnes was 31 years old, unmarried, and politically sophisticated. She had been involved in her brother's diplomatic negotiations. She understood regional power structures. She spoke Latin, Polish, and German. She was exactly the kind of captive Mongol intelligence operations prioritized. She was transported to a Mongol encampment and housed in a yurt with 2 other captured noblewomen. She was provided appropriate clothing, adequate food, and access to water for washing. She was not restrained. She was not threatened. She was simply confined. 3 days after her capture, an interpreter arrived. He was a Hungarian Christian who had been captured during Mongol operations in Hungary and had chosen to serve Mongol administration rather than face execution. He introduced himself by name, explained his role, and informed Agnes that a Mongol official wished to speak with her about the current political situation in Poland. The conversation that followed was not confrontational. The Mongol official, speaking through the interpreter, asked about Agnes's family, about her brother's death, about his sons, about disputed inheritance claims, about which noble families supported which claimants, about Bohemian involvement in Polish succession, about trade agreements between Silesia and neighboring territories. Agnes answered some questions, refused others. The official did not press when she refused. He simply moved to different topics. The session lasted approximately 2 hours. When it concluded, Agnes was returned to her yurt. The next session occurred 5 days later. Different official, different interpreter, same topics, different questions. This official asked about military commanders, about castle fortifications, about supply routes, about where noble families had sent their children for safety, about which cities had strong walls and which had weak defenses. Again, Agnes answered selectively. But across multiple sessions, conducted over 3 weeks, the information she provided, combined with information from other captives, created a comprehensive intelligence picture of Polish political fragmentation and military vulnerability. Subutai's forces did not continue deeper into Poland. They withdrew eastward, but the information collected from Agnes and other captured noblewomen was archived. It was recorded by Mongol scribes in multiple languages. It was transported back to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, where it was integrated into administrative records about European territories. This information would remain accessible for future campaigns. The Mongols did not conquer for immediate occupation. They gathered intelligence for eventual return. The Daughters of Hungary. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241 was the most devastating European campaign. King Beyla-Thwofe's army was destroyed at the Battle of Mohi in April. Approximately 60,000 Hungarians died. The kingdom fragmented. Nobles fled to fortified positions. Cities were abandoned. In the chaos, Mongol detachments systematically targeted locations where noble families had taken refuge. These were not random raids. They were intelligence-driven operations. Captured Hungarians from earlier engagements had identified specific castles, monasteries, and fortified estates where aristocratic families had gathered. One such location was a fortified monastery near Lake Balaton. Approximately 40 noblewomen had taken shelter there, including 3 daughters of regional magnates and 1 niece of King Beyla himself. The monastery had strong walls and adequate supplies. The women believed they were safe. Mongol forces arrived in late April. They did not assault the walls. They surrounded the monastery and waited. After 4 days, they sent an interpreter to the gate with a message. Surrender the noble women unharmed, and everyone else would be permitted to leave safely. Refuse, and the monastery would be burned with everyone inside. The monastery's abbess faced an impossible decision. She negotiated. She asked for guarantees. The Mongol commander provided them. The nuns could leave. The common refugees could leave. Only the noble women would be retained. The abbess consulted with the women. Some wanted to resist. Others wanted to surrender. After 2 days, the gates opened. The Mongol commander kept his word. Nuns and common refugees were allowed to depart. The noble women were escorted to a Mongol camp. They were housed separately, provided food, assigned guards. Within days, the questioning began. The niece of King Beyla was named Elizabeth. She was 17 years old. She had grown up in the royal court. She knew which nobles supported the king and which had competing ambitions. She knew about succession disputes. She knew about Hungarian fortifications, supply depots, and evacuation plans. She knew where the king's remaining family members had been sent for safety. Across multiple interrogation sessions, conducted over several weeks, she provided information, not all at once, not completely willingly, but gradually. Through careful questioning, through the creation of an environment where cooperation seemed preferable to resistance, through the psychological pressure of isolation and uncertainty, information emerged. The same process was repeated with dozens of other captured noblewomen across Hungary. Each provided fragments. Each fragment was recorded. Together, they formed comprehensive intelligence about Hungarian political structure, military capacity, economic resources, and social fractures. What did not happen? European chronicles from this period contain accounts of Mongol atrocities. Some are accurate, many are exaggerated, some are complete fabrications designed to mobilize Christian resistance. It is important to distinguish what actually occurred from what propaganda claimed occurred. There is no reliable evidence that Subutai's forces systematically sexually assaulted captured noblewomen. This absence is significant because sexual violence was common in medieval warfare. European armies routinely assaulted women in captured cities. The absence of similar patterns in Mongol operations was not because Mongols were more moral. It was because sexual assault interfered with intelligence objectives. A sexually assaulted captive becomes significantly less cooperative. She has nothing to lose by refusing to provide information. She has no reason to believe cooperation will improve her situation. She becomes a resistant subject rather than a manageable source. Mongol military doctrine, as practiced under Subutai's command, prioritized operational effectiveness over personal gratification. Soldiers who assaulted captives without authorization were punished, not because assault was considered morally wrong, but because it was considered operationally counterproductive. This does not mean Mongol conquests were humane. They were not. Mongol forces killed enormous numbers of people. They destroyed cities. They generated refugee crises. They created famines. But within that broader violence, there was systematic calculation about which categories of captives served which purposes. Noble daughters served intelligence purposes. Therefore, they were managed according to intelligence protocols. Those protocols prohibited behavior that would compromise their value as sources. The transportation east. After the Hungarian campaign concluded in early 1242, Mongol forces withdrew from Europe. The withdrawal was not retreat. It was planned extraction. Ogedei Khan, the Mongol ruler, had died in December 1241. Mongol law required senior commanders to return to Karakorum for the selection of a new Khan. Subutai began the withdrawal in March 1242. The withdrawal was methodical. Mongol forces did not flee. They moved in organized columns, transporting captured goods, livestock, and people. Among those transported east were approximately 200 European noblewomen, captured across multiple campaigns in Russia, Poland, and Hungary. They were not marched on foot. They were transported in wagons, similar to how Mongol families traveled. They were organized into groups of 10 to 15, each group supervised by a Mongol official and guards. They were provided food, water, and basic medical attention when injured or ill. They were not permitted to escape, but they were not subjected to forced marches that would have killed them. The journey from Hungary to Karakorum covered approximately 4,500 miles. It took nearly 8 months. The captives traveled through territories they had never imagined existed. Across the steppes of Ukraine and southern Russia, through the Caucasus region, across Central Asian deserts, past cities they could not name, speaking languages they did not recognize. Many died during the journey. Disease, exhaustion, winter cold, and accidents killed perhaps a third of the captives, but the majority survived, which was itself remarkable. Mongol logistics was sophisticated enough to sustain large groups of non-combatants across transcontinental distances. Arrival and integration. When the surviving European noblewomen reached Karakorum in late 1242, they entered a world completely alien to anything they had known. Karakorum was not a city as Europeans understood cities. It was an administrative center, a meeting point for Mongol clans, a hub where information from across the empire converged. The captives were not imprisoned in dungeons. They were assigned to households. Some were given to Mongol officials as servants. Others were assigned to weaving workshops where captured craftspeople from across Asia produced textiles. A few were assigned to administrative facilities where multilingual scribes maintained empire records. This assignment process was not arbitrary. It was based on capabilities identified during the interrogation process in Europe. Women who spoke multiple languages were assigned to translation work. Women with literacy skills were placed in record-keeping facilities. Women with aristocratic training in household management were assigned to Mongol noble households to manage domestic operations. They were not slaves in the sense that they could be bought and sold freely. They were unfree labor, assigned to specific functions, unable to leave their assigned positions, but provided with basic sustenance and, in some cases, surprising autonomy within defined roles. Princess Maria of Ryazan, captured in 1237, was assigned to a household belonging to one of Subutai's subordinate commanders. She managed the household's domestic operations, supervised servants, organized food storage, and handled textile production. She was not permitted to leave the household. She was not permitted to send messages to her homeland. But within the household, she exercised authority over other servants and slaves. She learned Mongolian. She adopted Mongol dress. Over time, the distinction between her identity as a Russian princess and her function as a Mongol household manager became increasingly ambiguous. Princess Agnes of Poland worked in a facility where captured European scribes maintained Latin records of Mongol administrative decisions affecting European territories. She translated documents from Latin to Polish and back. She corresponded with other European captives working in similar facilities. She never returned to Poland. She died in Karakorum sometime in the 1250s. Her death was not recorded with any particular significance. She had become a minor administrative functionary in a massive imperial system. Elizabeth of Hungary was assigned to a Mongol noble's household as a language tutor. The noble's children were being educated in multiple languages as part of their preparation for administrative roles. Elizabeth taught them Latin and Hungarian. She lived in relative comfort. She was never ransomed. She never married. European chronicles do not record what happened to her after 1245. She disappeared into the empire's administrative apparatus. The Information Archive. The intelligence gathered from captured European noblewomen was not discarded after interrogation. It was archived. Mongol administrative practice involved systematic record-keeping, information about territories, even territories not currently under Mongol control, was maintained for potential future use. In Karakorum, scribes maintained records in multiple languages: Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Latin. These records included detailed information about European political structures, noble family relationships, territorial boundaries, military capacities, economic resources, and social conflicts. This information was compiled from multiple sources: merchants who traveled through Europe, captured soldiers, diplomatic envoys, and captured noblewomen. The women's contributions were particularly valuable because they provided information about succession disputes, marriage negotiations, and internal family conflicts, information that merchants and soldiers would not typically possess. These records were consulted when Mongol forces considered future campaigns. When planning operations, Mongol commanders could access detailed intelligence about which European families were in conflict, which cities had strong defenses, which territories had experienced recent famines, and which nobles might be willing to cooperate with Mongol authority in exchange for advantage over local rivals. The Mongol Empire never returned to Europe in force. Ogedai's death and subsequent succession disputes shifted imperial focus toward China and the Middle East. But the intelligence infrastructure that Subutai built during the European campaigns remained operational. The information gathered from European captives remained archived and accessible. What Subutai actually did. Subutai did not torture captured princesses. He did not execute them publicly. He did not ransom them back to their families. He did not assault them. He did not parade them through Mongol cities as trophies. He processed them as information assets. He extracted intelligence through systematic, non-violent interrogation protocols. He transported them across Asia as part of logistical operations. He integrated them into the administrative apparatus of the Mongol Empire. He archived the information they provided for potential future military operations. This approach was neither merciful nor cruel in ways that medieval Europeans would have recognized. It was bureaucratic. It reflected a military system that treated warfare as an information problem and conquered populations as resources to be categorized, allocated, and utilized according to strategic priorities. The captured princesses of Europe were not destroyed. They were repurposed. Their noble status, which in Europe had represented political power, became in Mongol captivity a qualification for administrative function. Their knowledge of European politics, which had made them valuable marriage assets, became intelligence data. Their identities as daughters of ruling families became largely irrelevant once they were absorbed into an empire that did not recognize European titles as meaningful. Many of them survived. They lived years or decades in Mongol territories. They learned new languages. They adapted to new roles. They disappeared from European historical records because Europe had no framework for tracking individuals who had been removed from European social structures and integrated into Asian administrative systems. Their families did not know what happened to them. European chronicles assumed they had been killed or enslaved in ways that medieval Europeans understood slavery, but the reality was more complex and more alien than simple death or bondage. They had been processed, transported, archived, and utilized according to the operational logic of the most sophisticated military intelligence system of the 13th century. What Subutai did to captured princesses was not dramatic, it was methodical, and it was effective.